Welcome to this wild ride through one of the creepiest true stories ever written down in Louisiana history. Before we get going, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and exactly what time it is where you are. We really want to know which places and what times of day or night people are tuning in to hear these accounts. The very first time anyone wrote down the name Moss Hollow was in 1849, but local history folks think the place was probably already there for at least 10 years before that. It was sitting way deep inside the Atchafalaya Swamp in Louisiana, about 23 miles southwest of the town we now call St. Martinville. Nobody put it on any official maps until a land survey in 1852 briefly mentioned it existed, and then that paperwork just mysteriously vanished from state records like it never happened. What little we actually know comes from scattered bits and pieces. A super water-damaged journal found at Reverend Thomas Whitfield's house in 1863, some partial census papers from 1850 with really strange notes written on them, and stories passed down through generations of families who lived in the parishes nearby. These stories describe a place where runaway slaves didn't just build a hiding spot, they built a whole underground community beneath the swamp, a whole network of tunnels and caverns that formed naturally in the limestone rock sitting under all that mud. According to the journal of a mapmaker named Elias Montgomery who went into the area in 1854, the local people flat out refused to take him past a row of cypress trees to the east. When he kept pushing, an old man leaned over and whispered that the ground out there doesn't hold its secrets very well, and that some nights the earth itself seems like it's breathing. Montgomery never finished his mapping trip. His gear was found 3 weeks later, just left behind near a sinkhole about 7 miles from where he last wrote anything down. His body was never found. People say this whole community was started by a guy that everyone just called Solomon, a really skilled carpenter who escaped from the Fairchild Plantation in northern Mississippi back in 1838. What makes this story extra strange isn't just that a hidden settlement existed. Tons of those existed all over the South during slavery times, but it's how incredibly elaborate and well-built it was, and the deeply disturbing things that happened when people finally stumbled upon it. According to interviews done with descendants of former slaves in 1896 by a Chilean university researcher named Harold Jenkins, Solomon had this almost spooky ability to understand the swamp. Jenkins wrote that an elderly woman told him Solomon could predict where sinkholes would open up weeks before they actually appeared. She said her grandmother told her he would press his ear to the ground every single morning and listen to what she called the swamp's heartbeat. Jenkins's research notes just abruptly stop with a strange little observation. His subject got really upset when he asked about where the community got its water and refused to keep talking. What we know with a bit more certainty is that in July of 1855, a group of hunters from St. Martinville accidentally stumbled onto signs of the settlement after following a really weird trail of messed up plants and vegetation. The men reported what they found to local authorities, who then organized a much bigger group to go check things out. This group had 12 men, including a county sheriff and 2 guys from nearby plantations, and they headed out on August 3, 1855. Only 5 of them came back 4 days later, and their stories about what they found were so wildly different from each other that investigators eventually just wrote them off as being sick from swamp fever or having drunk bad water. But there was one thing all their stories had in common. They all described a bunch of mud brick buildings that were partly underwater, with narrow little passageways leading deeper down into the earth. Sheriff James Holcomb wrote in his official report that they saw what looked like handmade wooden support beams going from the entrances of the buildings down into the dark, murky water. He said the craftsmanship was unlike anything he had ever seen, with joints that seemed to lock together without any nails or rope holding them. The report got filed and then was later quietly taken out of county records during the Reconstruction period. A short article in the St. Martinville Courier on August 12, 1855 barely mentions the expedition at all, just saying the group sent to check out rumors of people living illegally in the southern marshlands had come back with reports of abandoned structures and that nobody had been caught. No follow-up articles ever showed up in that paper. But a personal letter that expedition member William Preston wrote to his brother in Charleston on August 17, 1855 tells a whole different story. He said he couldn't shake the memory of that place. The tunnels went way further than should have been possible given how flooded everything was. He said they followed one passage for what felt like half a mile, with their torches lighting up walls covered in strange markings, not African symbols like one of the reverends in the group suggested, but something completely different that seemed to pulse in the flickering light. A man named Davidson got separated from the group for just a couple of minutes. But when they found him, he swore he had been wandering around for hours and had been talking to people he couldn't even begin to describe. This letter was found tucked inside family papers that were donated to the Charleston Historical Society in 1932. What makes the Moss Hollow case particularly disturbing is what happened in the weeks right after that expedition. 3 of the men who made it back ended up dying under really strange circumstances. Thomas Davidson, who had gotten lost, was found hanging from a cypress tree near his home on September 1st. The coroner called it suicide and noted that Davidson had been really nervous and shaky ever since he got back. Robert Jenkins died of what was written down as swamp fever on September 9th, but his wife later said his symptoms were actually him waking up terrified and feeling like water was filling his lungs even when he was nowhere near water. Sheriff Holcomb quit his job on September 21st and reportedly left Louisiana entirely, and no records exist anywhere showing where he went. The most detailed account of what the expedition might have encountered comes from a journal believed to have belonged to Solomon himself. It was found during a drainage project in 1964, and even though it was really badly damaged by water and time, it had entries going all the way from 1839 to 1854. The handwriting changes noticeably as the years go on, getting more and more precise and geometric looking. An entry from January 23, 1843 says they finished the western tunnel that day and that the ground was more stable than they expected. He wrote that the water now seeped in patterns he could predict and that 27 people were now living in their hollow and not one of them wanted to go back to the world above. Another entry from March 10, 1846 says the deeper rooms stayed dry even after really heavy rain and mentions strange echoes. He wrote that the kids were saying they could hear singing coming from the North Passage even though none of their people were there, and that he needed to go check it out the next day. The very last entry anyone could still read from May 4, 1854 is just one single sentence: "It has found us. Nobody knows what it was, and nobody knows what happened to the people who lived there." No bodies were ever found at the site, and no records show any former Moss Hollow residents turning up in other communities or registering with Freedmen's Bureau offices after the Civil War. A geology survey done by Louisiana State University in 1948 found some pretty unusual stuff in the area where Moss Hollow was thought to have been. Professor Richard Garrett wrote that the patterns of dips and depressions in the ground suggested a network of underground rooms about 15 to 20 feet below the current swamp level. But the rock samples showed hardened clay that didn't naturally belong in that region, almost like the cavities had been lined with some kind of man-made material. And even more puzzling, there were traces of salt water found that deep underground, even though the spot was more than 70 miles from the Gulf. In 1957, an anthropologist named Margaret Wilkins tried to set up a proper archaeological dig at the site, but had to drop the whole thing after her funding got pulled out of nowhere. In her personal notes, later donated to Tulane University's archives, she wrote that the department said they had safety concerns after a second sinkhole opened up right next to their equipment, right exactly where they had planned to start digging the very next day. She wrote it was hard not to see the timing of that as really peculiar. What is maybe the most unsettling part of the Moss Hollow story isn't what was found, but what's still hidden. In 1968, during the height of the civil rights movement, a historian named Benjamin Carter published a controversial paper arguing that federal authorities had deliberately covered up information about Moss Hollow and places like it. Carter wrote that the story of helpless, dependent slaves just waiting to be freed didn't match up with evidence of self-sufficient, organized communities that were operating completely outside the control of plantations. He said Moss Hollow wasn't just a quirky historical curiosity, but a direct challenge to established power structures. Carter's paper was mostly dismissed by his colleagues, and he never published on the topic again. His research materials were reportedly destroyed in a basement flood at Howard University in 1969. But a former student of Carter's who asked to stay anonymous during a 1982 oral history project said that Carter had received a package containing a small wooden box carved with unusual geometric patterns right before he stopped his research. The student said he opened it while they were sitting in his office, and inside was a single piece of old parchment that looked like a map, plus something else, something small the student couldn't quite see clearly. Whatever it was, it completely drained the color from Carter's face. He asked the student to leave right away. The very next day, he announced he was taking a sabbatical and packed up his entire office that same week. Local residents have been talking about weird stuff happening near where Moss Hollow is believed to have been for a very long time. People keep describing unexplained lights you can see through the mist on really humid nights. Others mention a low, deep humming that seems to come up from underground during certain phases of the moon. Wildlife in the area acts strange too. Hunters say animals avoid a roughly circular patch of land about 2 miles across, even though it should be perfectly good habitat. In 1962, a trapper named Jerome Tobito told the Lafayette Gazette that he had found what looked like a partial tunnel entrance after a really bad storm knocked over several cypress trees. He said the opening was perfectly round, about the size of a wagon wheel, and lined with what looked like fired clay. He said he shined his light down into it but couldn't see the bottom. He dropped a stone in and never heard it land. When someone asked if he'd reported it to the authorities, Tobito allegedly just laughed and said some things are better left alone. Every attempt to find the entrance again, based on Tobito's description, came up empty. What happened to Solomon and his community is one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in all of Louisiana history. Some historians think the people simply left after their location got discovered, spreading out to other hidden communities or heading north. Others point to more troubling possibilities, noting that there's no physical evidence of anyone migrating away and that the abandonment appears to have happened all at once in a sudden, abrupt way. The Journal of Reverend Thomas Whitfield, found after he died in 1863, has a curious entry from October 17, 1855. He wrote that a man visited him claiming he had come from beneath the earth. The man's clothes were caked in a gray mud unlike anything the Reverend had ever seen in that parish. He wouldn't give his name, but asked the Reverend to write down that they had gone deeper, following the voices. When the Reverend asked what he meant, the man said only that Solomon had found another way down and that they would not be coming back. The man left before sunrise. The mud he had tracked into the Reverend's study had hardened like cement by morning. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery came during a Corps of Engineers drainage project in 1959. Workers found what looked like a narrow vertical shaft about 3 feet wide going straight down into the bedrock. The walls of the shaft were lined with the same fired clay mentioned in earlier accounts. Project supervisor Harold Williams reported that the shaft went at least 60 feet down before it got too narrow for their equipment to follow. At the very bottom of the part they could reach, workers found a single item, a hand-carved wooden box containing 27 small figurines, each one carved to look like a human in a different pose. The figurines were made from a dense black wood that plant scientists couldn't identify. According to Williams's report, the figurines were sent to the University of Louisiana for analysis. But university records show no sign of them ever arriving, and when Williams followed up asking where they were, he just kept getting the runaround from officials. In a letter to his boss dated March 3, 1960, Williams wrote that he found it very strange that nobody could account for artifacts of such clear historical importance, and that even more troubling was the fact that some officials were flat out denying that his crew had ever found any shaft or structure at all. Williams got reassigned to a project in Arkansas the very next month. The area believed to contain what's left of Moss Hollow has gone through major changes over the past century. Drainage projects, industrial development, and natural shifts in the swamp's water flow have dramatically changed the landscape. In 1968, a portion of the region was declared a protected wetland, effectively shutting down any further exploring or building there. Officially, the reason was environmental concerns, but some local historians have pointed out that the timing, happening right as interest in Moss Hollow was picking back up after Carter's paper, raises some real questions about the true reason behind the decision. Today, nobody knows the exact location of Moss Hollow. Modern technology like ground-penetrating radar and satellite images has found several odd things beneath the current swamp level that could match the described settlement. But the combination of protected status, incredibly tough terrain, and the area's reputation has stopped anyone from doing a real comprehensive investigation. A curious little extra piece to the story came out in 1967 when an elderly woman named Clara Johnson was interviewed as part of a folk history project in St. Landry Parish. Johnson was 93 years old at the time and claimed her grandmother had been one of the original residents of Moss Hollow. According to the transcript, Johnson said her grandmother told her Solomon wasn't building a refuge, he was building a doorway. She said they found something down there in the wet dark, something old, older than slavery, older than America itself, and that it promised them freedom but not the kind they had been looking for. When asked to explain more, Johnson reportedly just smiled and said, "Some chains you can see and some you can't." The recording of that interview was filed in the Louisiana State University Folklore Collection, but then went missing during a records check in 1968. The written transcript is the only thing left of Johnson's testimony. She passed away in 1969, taking whatever else she knew with her to the grave. Maybe the most straightforward explanation for why Moss Hollow was abandoned is just the environment itself. Geologists point out that the area floods regularly and the ground is really unstable, which would make living underground there incredibly difficult over the long term. The community might have been wiped out by a natural disaster, a collapse, or a sudden flood, with survivors scattered and all records simply lost to time. But that explanation doesn't really hold up against the stranger parts of the story: the apparent sophistication of the construction, the total lack of physical remains, and the consistent reports of unexplainable things happening at the site. Those things have sparked all kinds of speculation, from the totally reasonable to the completely wild. Some people think Moss Hollow shows that enslaved people had advanced engineering knowledge that has been deliberately scrubbed from the historical record. Others suggest more out-there ideas involving underground waterways leading to the Gulf, or connections to Native American legends about worlds existing underground. What we can say for certain is that something existed in the swamp southwest of St. Martinville, a community that left behind just barely enough evidence to prove it was real, but not enough information to paint a full picture of what it was or what became of it. The scrappy records, the wildly different testimonies, and the physical oddities create a historical puzzle that keeps resisting any solution. In 1954, historian Eliza Montgomery, no relation to the disappeared mapmaker, wrote what is probably the most fitting description of the whole case. She called Moss Hollow a peculiar kind of historical ghost, solid enough to cast a shadow across documented history, but too wispy to ever be fully pinned down in our understanding. She said it exists in the gap between established fact and folklore, between the world we acknowledge and the world we sense but can't quite name. On rare occasions, visitors to the Atchafalaya Basin report hearing unusual sounds coming from beneath the murky water, a rhythmic tapping that some say sounds like carpentry tools or the building of wooden structures. Park rangers wave these accounts away as just the natural sounds of the swamp, water moving, timber shifting, or wildlife going about their business. Yet the reports keep coming in, especially during the spring months when water levels are going up and down. In 1963, a soil sample collected about 11 miles from where Moss Hollow is believed to have been contained traces of a weird clay compound with properties similar to modern concrete. Analysis showed the material had been fired at temperatures that would have been really hard to reach with 19th century technology. The results were flagged as unusual, and the sample was supposed to be sent for more testing. Records say it was transferred to a facility in Atlanta, but nobody ever confirmed it arrived. Local folklore has wrapped the Moss Hollow mystery into bigger stories about the whole region. Some fishing guides call particularly deep sections of the swamp Solomon's Chambers. Others warn people not to venture too far into certain areas after the sun goes down, saying the boundaries between worlds get thin when darkness falls over the water. The descendants of people who once lived near Moss Hollow keep a curious old tradition alive. When building new homes, some families bury a small sealed clay box under the northeast corner of the foundation. When asked about this, many of them claim they have no idea where the tradition came from or what it's even for. Others give vague answers about keeping the ground solid or respecting what came before. Whatever's inside those boxes is a closely kept secret, though rumors say they contain soil, small wooden carvings, or written messages. During really dry summers when water levels in the basin drop a lot, local authorities say they see a noticeable jump in unauthorized groups sneaking into remote areas of the swamp. In 1958, 1967, and 1965, all drought years, multiple groups were caught trying to get into restricted areas with digging equipment. Not one of them could clearly explain why they were interested in those specific spots. A handwritten note found in the margins of a surveyor's map dated 1856 offers maybe the most haunting suggestion of what may have become of the people of Moss Hollow. The tiny, barely readable writing says, "They did not flee, they did not die, they descended. The story of Moss Hollow is still unfinished, a historical fragment that just won't fit neatly into any category or tidy explanation." What started as a search for freedom turned into something else entirely, something that's still dodging full understanding more than a century later. The swamp keeps its secrets buried under layers of mud, water, and time. Every now and then something surfaces, a document, an artifact, a strange geological finding that briefly lights up a piece of the mystery before getting pulled back into the bigger puzzle. Researchers who look into the case today do it carefully, knowing full well about the pattern of disappeared evidence, abandoned research, and unexplained phenomena that has followed every previous investigation. Some information is deliberately kept secret, passed down through family lines rather than handed over to academic researchers. Some stories aren't meant for everyone to know, explained one elderly resident of St. Martinville in 1965 when asked what locals knew about the settlement. Some truths belong to those who earned them. The last official attempt to find physical evidence of Moss Hollow happened in 1967 when a University of Louisiana team did a limited survey using the then brand new sonar technology. Their equipment kept breaking down over and over, producing images described as inconsistent with any known geological formations. The project was shut down after less than a week, officially due to budget problems. 3 team members reportedly quit their jobs shortly afterward. Today, the area is basically unreachable, blocked off by both the natural obstacles of the swamp itself and by legal restrictions. People who get close to where Moss Hollow is believed to have been often describe a feeling of being watched, of eyes tracking their movements from beneath the dark water. Wildlife acts erratically out there. Birds go completely quiet, insects stop buzzing. The air feels heavier, charged with a tension nobody can put their finger on. What truly happened to Solomon and the 27 souls who followed him beneath the swamp is still unknown. No bodies, no clear evidence of what became of them has ever been found. Only fragments remain, unusual clay formations, inexplicable structures under the mud, stories passed through generations in hushed voices. Maybe the most telling piece of evidence is what doesn't exist at all. Despite huge amounts of records about runaway slaves across the South, not one single account mentions anybody who escaped from Moss Hollow. No oral histories describe refugees from the settlement showing up in other communities. Unlike other maroon societies that eventually broke up with members merging back into broader society, the people of Moss Hollow simply vanished from the historical record. As one researcher noted in 1965, it's as if they stepped out of our world entirely. In the spring of 1968, a severe storm caused serious flooding throughout the Atchafalaya Basin. When the water went back down, local fishermen reported that a section of swampland about 17 miles southwest of St. Martinville had completely changed. Where there had previously been a slight bump up in the landscape, there was now a perfectly circular hole in the ground about 40 feet across. At its center, a dark opening extended downward into the earth. Authorities immediately roped off the entire area. Official statements cited dangerous conditions and environmental concerns. No journalists were allowed anywhere near it. 3 days later, the site was permanently restricted under federal wetland protection laws. No official explanation for the formation was ever given. People who got a peek at the depression before it was blocked off described it as unnaturally perfect in its shape. One anonymous witness who spoke to a local newspaper claimed to have seen markings around the rim like writing, but not any writing they had ever seen before. Another person reported hearing something that sounded like singing coming from the opening, but with no words they could make out. The story of Moss Hollow stays unfinished, a historical ghost that every now and then makes itself known before slipping back into the shadows. Whatever secrets are sitting beneath the murky waters of the Atchafalaya Basin, they remain carefully hidden, reachable only through fragments of evidence and the whispered stories of people who carry the knowledge that sometimes the ground beneath your feet holds a whole lot more than just dirt. For those who know where to look, signs of Moss Hollow's existence are still out there. Unusual patterns of plants that form perfect circles in the swamp, water that flows against the natural current in certain spots, the persistent total absence of wildlife in areas that should be teeming with animals, and occasionally on still nights when the moon is dark, lights that seem to glow beneath the surface of the water, moving slowly and deliberately, like lanterns being carried by hands you can't see. The most recent documented mention of Moss Hollow appeared in 1969 in the will of Elijah Johnson, a descendant of Clara Johnson. Among his belongings was listed one wooden box containing soil from the hollow, to be returned to the water upon his death. The executor of his estate reported that the box, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand and carved all over with intricate geometric patterns, was indeed filled with a dark, dense soil unlike anything found in the region. As instructed, it was dropped into the waters of the Atchafalaya Basin during a private ceremony attended only by family members. One person who was there later described seeing ripples moving against the current from the point where the box hit the water, as if something beneath the surface had reached up to receive it. Solomon's community, whatever its ultimate fate, is a disturbing reminder that history is not a complete record, but rather a collection of fragments, some saved, some lost, some deliberately hidden. The spaces between those fragments, the silences and the gaps in what we understand, often contain the most unsettling truths. As the waters of the Atchafalaya keep rising and falling with the seasons, covering and uncovering the secrets buried in the mud, the question stays the same: did Solomon find the freedom he was looking for in the depths beneath the swamp? Or did he and his followers find something else entirely, something that offered a different kind of freedom at a price we can only try to imagine? The swamp stays silent. The waters hide what lies beneath. And sometimes on the darkest nights, locals swear they can hear the sound of hammers and saws echoing up from below the surface. The sound of something still being built down in the depths, one careful piece at a time. Maybe the most unsettling accounts come from the people who have spent their whole lives out on the water. Fishermen and trappers talk about moments when the line between the surface and the deep seems to blur together. Raymond Broussard, a lifelong St. Martinville resident who passed away in 1966, told researchers in 1959 that there are places where the bottom ain't really the bottom, where what looks like solid ground shifts if you stare at it long enough. He said his daddy had shown him those spots when he was just a little boy and told him never to drop anchor there, said the mud might just decide to pull you down. A geological assessment done in 1960 by Louisiana State University identified several unusual underground structures in the region, including what appeared to be a network of rooms about 25 to 30 feet beneath the swamp floor. Dr. Howard Phillips, who led the study, noted that the formations didn't match the typical underground landscape you'd expect to find in limestone regions. He wrote that the regularity of the spaces suggested either an extremely unusual natural formation or, more controversially, evidence of human modification. Phillips asked for funding for a more comprehensive investigation, but was turned down. He left the university the following year, citing professional differences with the administration. What little physical evidence exists of Moss Hollow has been scattered, lost, or locked away in private collections. In 1961, a fisherman pulled what appeared to be a hand-carved wooden door out of the swamp about 12 miles southwest of St. Martinville. The door was made of cypress and measured roughly 4 feet by 2 feet, and it had unusual iron hinges of a design that didn't match anything from 19th century American craftsmanship. Even more striking were the symbols carved into it, geometric patterns arranged in rings inside rings. The fisherman reportedly kept the door in his shed for several weeks before a government man came and offered to buy it. Nobody knows where the door is now. A photo of the door taken by the fisherman's son before the sale turned up in 1968 as part of a collection of regional oddities on display at a small museum in Lafayette. The curator, when asked about it, said it had been loaned anonymously and later taken back by the owner. The photograph itself disappeared from the museum archives during a reorganization in 1969. In 1962, during a particularly severe drought, water levels in parts of the Atchafalaya Basin dropped to record lows, uncovering landscape features normally hidden under several feet of water and mud. A local resident named Morris Tibito described seeing what looked like the tops of walls arranged in a perfect circle in an area about 20 miles southwest of St. Martinville. He insisted in an interview with the Lafayette Gazette that they weren't natural, they were placed there, built by human hands. By the time officials showed up to investigate, heavy rains had already brought the water back up to its normal level, covering up whatever Tibito might have seen. Aerial photographs taken by the U.S. Geological Survey during that same drought period show several unusual circular patterns in the plants and soil distribution in the general area Beto described. Analysis of the images concluded the formations were likely the result of natural water flow processes, though several researchers pointed out how strikingly regular the patterns were. The original photographs were damaged during improper storage in 1967, making any detailed re-examination impossible. The historical record contains one particularly disturbing account that might relate to what became of Moss Hollow's inhabitants. In September 1855, about a month after the expedition that reportedly found the settlement, a steamboat captain named James Harrington wrote about a strange encounter in his log while navigating the lower Atchafalaya River. Harrington wrote that he observed several individuals coming out of the water at the eastern bank, about 15 miles north of Morgan City. What was most unusual was their appearance. They were covered head to toe in a gray mud that had hardened on their skin like armor. He wrote that they moved in a way he couldn't really describe, almost mechanical. When he called out to them, they made no response but turned as one and went right back into the water. His first mate wanted to investigate, but Harrington said he thought that was unwise and they kept going. He counted 27 distinct figures before they disappeared beneath the surface. Harrington's account got basically no attention at the time and was dismissed as exaggeration or misidentification of local indigenous people. The exact number he counted, 27, matches the final population of Moss Hollow mentioned in Solomon's recovered journal. This connection wasn't noticed until historian Marcus Reynolds put the two accounts together in 1958. Reynolds was planning a comprehensive article looking at possible links between the settlement and Harrington's sighting, but died unexpectedly of a stroke before finishing it. His research materials, including copies of primary documents, were reportedly destroyed in a house fire 3 weeks after his death. The geography of the region itself adds another layer to the mystery. Modern water flow surveys show that parts of the Atchafalaya Basin have unexplained underground water movements, currents that flow on their own separate from the surface patterns and often against the direction you'd expect. In 1965, a hydrologist named Patricia Lamont documented what she called vertical circulation anomalies in the area believed to contain Moss Hollow. She wrote that water appeared to be moving not just sideways, but also up and down through underground rock layers in patterns that go against normal scientific principles. She also found the puzzling presence of water with high salt content at depths where fresh water should have been. Lamont's research suggested the existence of previously unknown underground channels connecting to deeper water sources, or possibly even all the way to the Gulf of Mexico despite being over 70 miles inland. Those kinds of connections could theoretically back up the accounts of tunnels and flooded passages described in various historical documents about Moss Hollow. Lamont planned further investigation, but was reassigned to a project in Florida before finishing her work. Her preliminary findings were filed away but never published in any academic journals. The historical context of Moss Hollow adds yet another dimension to the mystery. The period from 1830 to 1860 saw a lot of maroon communities, settlements of escaped slaves who built their own independent societies in remote, hard-to-reach areas, pop up all across the southern United States. Most of those communities were eventually discovered and broken up. Their inhabitants were recaptured or forced to run even further. The ones that lasted the longest were usually in mountain regions or dense forests where natural barriers gave them protection. What makes Moss Hollow stand out is its reported underground nature. No other documented maroon community ever tried to set up permanent underground homes, especially not in a swamp environment where flooding would be a constant problem. The engineering knowledge it would take to create stable structures beneath a swamp floor with working drainage and airflow would have been enormous. But historical records show that Solomon was a carpenter with no formal training in mining or underground construction. This gap has led some researchers to suggest the community might have found natural formations already there and modified them, rather than building everything new from scratch. The limestone underneath parts of the Atchafalaya Basin could theoretically hold natural caverns, though that kind of thing isn't typically found in the region's geology. Another theory put forward by geologist Richard Martinez in 1964 suggests the settlement might have used sinkholes and natural low spots as starting points. gradually expanding them into more complex structures. Martinez pointed to unusual mineral deposits found in soil samples from the region as evidence that people had significantly altered the underground environment there. His research was never published, and Martinez refused to talk about the topic in later interviews, citing only professional concerns. The fate of Solomon himself remains perhaps the most enduring question in the whole Moss Hollow mystery. No records show him being captured or dying, and there's no evidence he ever came out of the swamp to start over somewhere else. The last confirmed mention of him is in his own journal with that cryptic final entry, "It has found us." In 1960, an elderly woman named Sarah Williams, who said she was a descendant of a family that had lived near the settlement, told a folklore researcher that her great-grandmother said Solomon wasn't trying to hide from slave catchers in the end. He was trying to reach something he had heard calling to him from the deep places. She said he would sit for hours with his ear pressed to the ground listening, and that one day he told everyone he knew where they needed to go. Williams couldn't or wouldn't say more about what that destination might have been. The spotty evidence surrounding Moss Hollow has produced all kinds of theories over the decades, ranging from totally reasonable to completely out there. Some historians think the settlement was simply abandoned after it was discovered, with the people spreading out to other regions. Others think the community was wiped out by disease or natural disaster, maybe a catastrophic collapse of their underground structures during a flood. More controversial theories suggest that evidence was deliberately hidden by authorities who found the settlement's existence politically inconvenient, or by private interests looking to exploit whatever resources the community might have found. The pattern of vanished documents, reassigned researchers, and lost artifacts does give some support to theories of intentional cover-up, though no definitive proof has ever come out. Maybe the most unsettling pattern in the entire Moss Hollow case is how consistently people who investigate it eventually just walk away. Historians, geologists, anthropologists, and journalists who have gone deep on this story have frequently ended their work abruptly, often leaving their jobs, switching fields, or refusing to ever talk about what they found. While bad luck and personal circumstances explain some individual cases, the overall pattern itself raises real questions. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, who dug into the case in the 1950s before suddenly switching her research focus to Caribbean history, wrote in a private letter found after her death that there is something about this particular story that resists being examined. She said every thread she pulled seemed to unravel something else entirely, something she was increasingly sure she did not want to see fully. Montgomery never published her findings on Moss Hollow, and her research notes were not found anywhere among her papers after she died in 1964. The physical landscape itself seems to push back against anyone trying to investigate. Attempts to carry out thorough archaeological surveys have been stopped by flooding, shifting terrain, and equipment failures. In 1963, a team from Chilean University had plans for a big examination of the area, but had to abandon the project after 3 team members came down with a strange illness involving disorientation, hearing things that weren't there, and extreme sensitivity to light. Medical exams found no known cause, and the symptoms went away once those people left the region. Local attitudes toward the Moss Hollow mystery show a complicated relationship with this piece of regional history. Many residents of parishes near the presumed site have a curious kind of mixed feeling about it. They acknowledge the settlement's historical importance while being really reluctant to get into the details. Some stories belong to the telling, not the writing down. One elderly resident explained in 1957 when asked why local oral traditions about Moss Hollow rarely showed up in written accounts. This reluctance extends to actually going near the place too. Fishing guides and trappers who know the basin well often steer clear of certain areas, especially after dark. When pushed for reasons, many give vague answers about bad water or places where the bottom isn't right. Others just say that some parts of the swamp don't welcome visitors, a feeling that has been passed down across generations of local people. In 1968, sociologist Dr. James Peterson noted what he called a geographic taboo operating in communities around the Atchafalaya Basin. He wrote that there is an unspoken but widely followed rule against entering or even discussing specific areas, and that this taboo appears strongest among families with the deepest historical ties to the region, suggesting it comes from real historical experience rather than just superstition. Peterson's observation lines up with patterns seen in other communities that have been through historical trauma. a group agreement to avoid certain topics or places tied to disturbing events. The environmental changes to the region over the past century have made it even harder to untangle the mystery. Logging, oil and gas exploration, flood control work, and natural shifts in the basin's water flow have significantly altered the landscape. Things that might once have been recognizable landmarks or ways into the area have been completely covered over or destroyed. The swamp takes things back and transforms them, burying the past under layers of silt and plants. Yet despite all that, the stories keep coming back. They surface in family histories, in the careful warnings passed from one generation of swamp guides to the next, in the unexplainable gaps in official records. They show up in the consistent accounts of weird phenomena tied to specific areas of the basin, areas that match up, however roughly, with where Moss Hollow is believed to have been. In 1963, a hunter named Joseph Martin reported finding what appeared to be a wooden post sticking out of the water in a remote section of the swamp. The post was about 4 inches across and extended about 2 feet above the water's surface, and it was carved with symbols similar to those described on the door that was recovered in 1961. Martin marked the spot on his map, but when he came back the very next day with a camera, the post was just gone. He told the St. Martinville Courier that it wasn't broken off or washed away. The water where it had been was perfectly still, like nothing had ever disturbed it. But he knew what he saw. In 1967, during construction of a pipeline about 15 miles from the presumed Moss Hollow site, workers uncovered what appeared to be a wooden structure buried about 12 feet down under the ground. According to the foreman's report, it was made of interlocking cypress beams forming a square frame about 8 feet on each side. Inside the frame, workers found several things: a hand-forged iron tool that looked like a chisel, fragments of pottery with unusual geometric designs, and what appeared to be a journal or ledger with its pages completely fused together from moisture and time. The items were collected by a representative from the company's legal department, supposedly to be turned over to the right authorities. No record exists of them ever arriving at any museum, university, or government office. When asked about it later, company officials just said that items of potential historical interest had been properly processed according to company policy. The workers who found the things were all moved to other projects within weeks. The most recent major development in the Moss Hollow case happened in 1968 when heavy spring flooding changed the water flow patterns all across the Atchafalaya Basin. When the water levels dropped back down, local pilots reported seeing unusual patterns in the plants and soil color in areas that had been underwater. Aerial photographs revealed what appeared to be a series of rings within rings, with the biggest one roughly 300 feet across, and it was only visible from up in the air. Scientists from the U.S. Geological Survey said the formations were the result of natural water flow processes, but noted their unusual regularity. Independent analysts pointed out how similar these patterns were to the geometric designs described in various artifacts connected to Moss Hollow. Before any more detailed examination could happen, the area was designated as protected wetland and access was shut off. Today, the story of Solomon and his underground community exists in this in-between space, halfway between documented history and regional folklore. The fragmented evidence neither fully confirms nor completely dismisses the more unusual parts of the accounts. What's left is a historical anomaly, a community that briefly popped up in the official record before vanishing not just physically but from history itself, leaving behind nothing but traces and questions. People who encounter the story today often find themselves pulled into the same pattern that has defined its investigation for over a century: first fascination, then frustration at how incomplete all the evidence is, and finally a weird reluctance to pull certain threads too far. As one researcher noted in 1965 before giving up her study, there is an emotional quality to this particular historical mystery that sets it apart from just normal academic curiosity. You get the unsettling feeling that the story isn't simply sitting there waiting to be discovered, but is instead watching the people who are trying to find it. Maybe the most fitting words come from the journal of William Preston, the expedition member who wrote to his brother about the settlement in 1855. In a personal diary found among family papers in 1939, Preston made one final reference to Moss Hollow 2 months after getting back. He wrote that he found himself unable to speak of what they saw beneath the water and mud, not because he was afraid no one would believe him, but because of a growing certainty that by describing it, he was somehow extending its reach. He said some discoveries should remain buried, not because they are false, but because they are too true in ways our minds are not built to handle. Solomon found something down there in the dark. Preston said he prayed it would stay there, listening to nothing but the water. The swamp continues its slow cycles of flood and recession. The water rises and falls, hiding and revealing things by turns. Occasionally something surfaces, a piece of wood carved with strange symbols, an unexplained shape in the landscape, a story passed down through generations in hushed voices. For brief moments, those fragments offer a tiny glimpse of a mystery that has been resisting answers for more than a century. Then the water rises again. The mud settles. The swamp takes its secrets back. And somewhere beneath the dark surface, in rooms carved from mud and clay and sheer human determination, the story of Solomon and his people keeps going, a history written not in books or official records, but in the spaces between what is known and what stays hidden. Visitors to the region today occasionally report hearing unusual sounds when the water is still and the night is dark, a rhythmic tapping that seems to come from beneath the surface, like the sound of construction work happening in hidden places. Others describe a feeling of being watched from below, of eyes following their movements from beneath the murky water. Park rangers and wildlife officials wave all these accounts away as the product of imagination fueled by local legends, or as misreading natural phenomena, the movement of sunken logs, nighttime wildlife, the weird acoustics of swamp sounds. Yet the reports keep coming in decade after decade with remarkable consistency. Maybe Solomon and his community did find what he was looking for when he first led them into the swamp, not just a hiding place from the world that had enslaved them, but a passage to somewhere else entirely. Maybe the 27 souls who vanished from the historical record are still out there, continuing their journey in places beyond our understanding. Or maybe the truth is simpler but just as haunting, a community that created something extraordinary, only to have their achievements systematically erased from official history, preserved only in fragments and whispered stories. A testament to human creativity and determination, buried under mud and water and deliberate forgetting. Whatever the reality, the swamp keeps its own counsel. The water hides more than it reveals. And the story of Moss Hollow remains what it has always been, a disturbing reminder that history is not a complete record, but rather a carefully selected collection, with the most unsettling truths often lying in the spaces between the documented facts, in the silences where certainty dissolves into questions. As William Preston wrote in his final known reference to the settlement, some doors once opened cannot be closed again. Some knowledge once gained cannot be unlearned. Solomon understood this. Preston believed that is why he went down into the dark water and mud, not to escape what was chasing him, but to chase something that was calling to him, something that promised answers to questions Preston didn't even dare try to put into words. The waters of the Atchafalaya continue to rise and fall. The mud shifts and settles, and somewhere beneath it all, the mystery of Moss Hollow persists, a historical ghost that refuses to rest, a story that keeps reaching up from the depths like hands coming out of dark water, reaching for someone who will listen.